scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa had lived in her house her entire life, but she had never noticed the small door under the stairs until today. It was painted the same yellow as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was barely tall enough for her to crawl through, and it had no handle, just a small keyhole. When she asked Mummy Pig about it, her mother's face went pale and she quickly changed the subject. Daddy Pig pretended he couldn't see the door at all, walking right past it as if it didn't exist. That night, Peppa heard scratching sounds coming from behind the door, like tiny claws against wood. She crept downstairs and pressed her ear against the door, hearing what sounded like children playing. But their laughter was wrong, too high, too sharp, lasting too long. The next morning, she found a small brass key on her pillow, old and tarnished, that fit perfectly into the door's keyhole. Against her better judgment, Peppa turned the key and heard the lock click open. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever into darkness. Cool air flowed out, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. As she peered into the tunnel, she heard her own voice calling from deep within the darkness. But the voice was singing a song she didn't remember learning. The voice grew closer, and Peppa realized with terror that something wearing her voice was crawling up through the tunnel toward her. She slammed the door shut and turned the key, but she could still hear her own voice on the other side, now pleading to be let out.
The visitor from the wall. When it was raining outside, Peppa and George were playing in their room. Everything was as usual: blocks, toys, laughter. But then Peppa noticed something strange. A crack in the wall right next to her bed seemed bigger than before, and inside it, there was something that looked like a face. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe it was just a drop of water running down the wall. But when she looked again, eyes, narrow, dark, motionless, and a mouth stretched into a long, thin smile. Peppa blinked, and the face was gone. She didn't say anything to George. She just turned away and went to sleep, telling herself it was only her imagination. But the next night, she saw it again. The face was closer, and now it moved. Not quickly, no, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if it was sliding beneath the layers of wallpaper. It was like watching a fish beneath the ice. Its eyes moved. They were watching Peppa. Peppa told Mummy Pig, but she only said that maybe the wall was a bit damp. Daddy Pig promised to patch the crack. But when he entered the room with his tools that evening, there was no crack. On the third night, Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was asleep, covered completely with his blanket. Peppa slowly turned toward the wall. Now the face was very close. It filled the whole crack. And then it came out. First came a hand, grey, thin, with long fingers like it was made of paper. Then the second hand. It was pulling itself out, blending with the color of the wallpaper. Its body was flat, as if it had always been part of the wall. It made no sound, only movement, slowly, smiling. Peppa couldn't scream. She was frozen, watching as the thing emerged. It had no legs. Its lower body just faded into the air. It slid across the floor, leaving a wet grey trail behind. It approached George's bed and stopped. A few long seconds, and then it disappeared. When the parents came in the morning, Peppa was sitting on her bed staring at the wall. George was asleep, but he never woke up again. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said his heart just stopped. Since then, Peppa no longer sleeps in that room. The wall was painted over, new wallpaper was put up. But sometimes, if you look closely at the pattern, you can see it shifting, as if something is moving underneath, and if you stare long enough, it smiles again.
The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired. It was bedtime, but Peppa couldn't sleep. Strange sounds came from downstairs. At first, it seemed like her family was still awake, talking quietly. But when she listened carefully, the voices didn't sound right. Peppa tiptoed downstairs and peeked into the living room. Her family was there, standing motionless in a circle, facing each other. They weren't talking, but she could still hear voices. The same voices, but coming from somewhere else, as if delayed. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George stood with eyes closed, mouths moving silently. The real voices seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere except from the people themselves. The voices had a normal family conversation about tomorrow's plans, but the words felt empty. Peppa crept back to her room, but the strange sounds continued. Now she heard footsteps walking through the house, but when she looked out the window, her family was still standing in the same circle. The footsteps repeated the same path over and over, kitchen to living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and back. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. Peppa held her breath. Someone was breathing behind the door, but too quietly to be any family member. The breathing was slow and patient, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. Peppa whispered, "Mummy." No answer. She tried Daddy, then George, but the breathing continued, steady and calm. Finally, she asked, "Who are you?" The breathing stopped completely. The silence was more terrifying than the sounds. When morning came, Peppa found her family having breakfast as if nothing happened. They laughed and talked as usual, but their voices sounded exactly like those from behind the walls. When she asked about the previous evening, they looked confused and said they'd gone to bed early. Throughout the day, Peppa heard the same footsteps, always invisible, always following the same path. Sometimes she'd turn a corner expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had become part of the house itself, a sound that never stopped. That night, Peppa realized the footsteps didn't match her family's routine. They followed a pattern established long ago, before she was born, when someone else lived in this house. Someone who was still walking through the rooms, still going about their daily life, completely unaware that anyone else was there.
The lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. Peppa Pig, the puppet friend. It started with a simple puppet. Daddy Pig found it in a box in the attic, old, handmade, with floppy arms and faded fabric. He thought George would like it and placed it on his bed. "What color is it?" Peppa asked. "It used to be red, I think," said Daddy Pig. "Now, just grey." The next day, George stopped playing with his dinosaur. He spent all his time with the puppet, talking to it, whispering, laughing. "What's its name?" Peppa asked. "She doesn't say it," George replied. "She's just a friend." "Do you make her talk?" "No," George smiled. "She answers." Peppa thought it was just a game, but that night she woke up to a sound. "George?" He was giggling softly. "Who's there?" There was an answer. Not George's voice, not a child's, a deep, hoarse adult voice. "I am a friend." Peppa froze. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. George was lying with his back to her. The puppet sat as usual on his bed, but its eyes were slightly open, even though they had been painted on before. In the morning, Peppa said nothing. She just hid the puppet in the closet, but an hour later, it was back on George's bed, sitting in the same position. Only now, its neck looked longer, and it had a smile. "She said you're angry," George said, "that you don't want me to play with her. She knows who you are and who you were." "What?" "She saw. Before." That evening, Daddy Pig threw the puppet away, took it out to the bin. That night, there was a scraping noise. Outside the door, like something dragging its limbs across the floor. Then, silence. In the morning, the puppet was sitting on the windowsill. Wet, the fabric was stained, like with dirt, or something worse. On the wall of the children's room, someone had drawn in charcoal. "You shouldn't have touched her." That night, Peppa stayed awake, watching. The puppet lay on the floor, still, until George giggled again. Then it lifted slightly. Its head jerked up, and it said, "I've always been with him." Peppa screamed. Daddy Pig ran into the room. The puppet lay still. But it had something new, a string, running from its back up to the ceiling. even though no one in the house had ever hung it.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows that moved independently. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos had changed. In every picture, the smiles were too wide. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as always, but she stood completely still, her back turned to Peppa. When Peppa called out good morning, Mummy Pig slowly turned around, revealing that same impossibly wide smile. Her voice sounded hollow. She offered Peppa her favorite cereal, but the bowl was filled with something dark and moving. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly motionless, staring straight ahead with unblinking eyes. When Peppa tried to get his attention, he turned his head toward her with a mechanical clicking sound. Daddy Pig emerged from behind his newspaper, but the paper was blank, completely white. He folded it carefully and placed it on the table. When he spoke, his voice echoed strangely. He suggested they all go for a drive. The family walked outside together, but their movements were synchronized in an unnatural way, like marionettes. The neighborhood looked the same, but all the other houses had their curtains drawn. The only sounds were their footsteps and a strange humming from underground. As they approached the car, Peppa noticed that their reflections in the windows were wrong. While the family stood together, their reflections showed them in different positions. The car doors opened by themselves. Inside the car, the radio played a song that Peppa had never heard before, but somehow knew all the words to. The melody was familiar yet wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. As they drove through town, all the shops were open, but no one was inside them. They arrived at a playground that Peppa didn't recognize. The swings moved by themselves and other children were playing, but they all looked exactly like Peppa and George, dozens of identical copies running in perfect circles. When Peppa tried to join them, she realized that she couldn't move her legs properly. Looking down, she saw that her feet were sinking into the ground. The other children stopped playing and turned to look at her, all wearing the same expression of hollow joy. As the
Peppa Pig, the cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's... Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, No cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out, don't turn around."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up. The sun was shining, but something felt different. The toys seemed to be watching them with glassy eyes, and the shadows appeared darker than usual. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast. The familiar yellow walls should have been comforting, but there was an odd silence. The clock had stopped ticking. As they sat at the table, they noticed Mummy Pig's reflection was smiling even when she wasn't. The family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's garden. The car ride was unusually quiet. As they arrived, the flowers seemed to turn their heads to follow them as they walked past. Grandpa Pig greeted them with his warm smile, but his eyes seemed hollow. He invited them into the living room where the television showed only static. His voice echoed strangely as he spoke about his vegetables. In the garden, George noticed that all the vegetables had grown faces. Carrots with tiny eyes, potatoes with crooked smiles, and tomatoes that whispered his name. He dropped his toy and ran toward the house. Peppa was helping water the plants when she realized the watering can was pouring something dark. The liquid made the flowers grow instantly, but they grew wrong with twisted stems. The roses developed thorns that looked like tiny teeth. The family gathered for tea. The tea was purple, and steam rose from it in shapes that looked like screaming faces. Nobody seemed to notice except Peppa, who watched in horror as her family drank the mysterious liquid. When leaving, they found their car had changed. The headlights looked like glowing eyes, and the grille resembled a grinning mouth. Daddy Pig started the engine, and it made a sound like distant laughter. The drive home took them through unfamiliar streets. The houses had windows that looked like watching eyes. At home, everything appeared normal, but the family photographs showed them with different expressions. In every picture, their smiles were too wide. That evening, the food on their plates kept changing. Peppa would see spaghetti, then blink and find tiny worms. At bedtime, their reflections in the bathroom mirror were delayed. The toothpaste foam swirled into shapes like tiny hands. In their bedroom, the wallpaper seemed to move and breathe. The toys had all turned to face their beds. George's dinosaur toy was no longer green but sickly gray. As Peppa lay in bed, she heard whispers from inside the walls. The voices spoke in an unknown language. George fell asleep but wasn't safe in his dreams. Peppa saw him tossing and turning. The night stretched endlessly with strange sounds. Footsteps in the hallway when everyone should be asleep. As dawn approached, the whispers faded. But Peppa knew this wasn't the end. The sun rose on another ordinary day, but they would never see their world the same way. When Mummy Pig called for breakfast, Peppa could hear an echo underneath. The horror had begun.